"Get him off my plane," Marla Kent said, and the words traveled down the aisle like cold air through a cracked window. Every face in rows 12 through 20 turned toward the man in the faded denim jacket and the little girl holding a yellow backpack against her chest. Caleb Mercer did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He only placed one steady hand on Sophie's shoulder, the way a father does when the world becomes too loud for a child. The cabin lights glowed soft and white above them. Outside the oval windows, rain slid across the wing in thin silver lines, and somewhere beneath the floor, the engines hummed with the restless patience of a machine waiting to be trusted. Sophie's lower lip trembled as she looked up at him. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" Caleb knelt beside seat 18C, close enough that she could hear him over the murmurs. "No, sweetheart. We are just going to breathe." "Sir," Marla said again, gripping the small radio clipped near her collar. "You and your daughter need to leave this aircraft." In first class, Richard Vale leaned back in his leather seat. One polished shoe crossed over the other, his silver watch catching the cabin light. He had been the first to complain, the loudest to sigh, the quickest to turn a frightened child into an inconvenience. "This is why airlines should think twice before letting charity cases board early," he said, just loud enough to wound, but soft enough to pretend he had not meant to. A few passengers looked away. A few kept watching. One young man near the aisle lifted his phone, and the tiny red recording light reflected in Sophie's wide blue eyes. Caleb saw it. He saw everything. The way Marla avoided his face and stared instead at his worn boots. The way Richard smiled when no one challenged him. The way Sophie's fingers curled around the small silver pin attached to her backpack. A winged badge with faded letters etched across the bottom. Raven 1. "My tickets are valid," Caleb said quietly. "My daughter has done nothing wrong." "Your daughter appears distressed," Marla replied, "and multiple passengers have expressed concern." "One passenger," Caleb said. "One passenger with a louder voice than everyone else." Richard gave a short laugh. Maybe the mechanic should save the speech for a bus station. The aisle went still. Caleb's jaw tightened, but only for a second. Dignity, he had learned, was not the absence of pain. It was what a man chose not to throw back when humiliation was handed to him in public. He stood slowly, lifting Sophie's backpack from under the seat. "Come on, Soph," he whispered. "We will figure it out." Then it happened. 3 short beeps sounded from the cockpit. Not loud, not dramatic, just 3 clean electronic notes beneath the murmur of impatient travelers. Most people barely noticed. Marla glanced toward the front, irritated by another delay. Richard checked his watch. Sophie squeezed her father's hand. But Caleb stopped moving. His eyes shifted upward toward the ceiling panels, then toward the sealed cockpit door, and all the color drained from his face. 5 minutes earlier, they had been a poor-looking father and daughter being pushed out of a plane. Now Caleb Mercer was listening to a warning no ordinary passenger would understand. He leaned closer to Marla, his voice low, calm, and suddenly different. That alert should not sound on the ground. 3 hours earlier, Caleb Mercer had stood in the blue-gray light of his kitchen, tying Sophie's sneakers while the old wall clock ticked above the sink like it was counting down a promise. Their flight to Denver was not a vacation, not really. It was a return. 8 years after Sophie was born, and 4 years after her mother, Rachel Mercer, never came home from a medical rescue flight in the Rockies, North Star Airways was holding a memorial for the crew members whose names had become engraved on a bronze wall near the airport chapel. Caleb had avoided that wall for a long time. Too long, maybe. But Sophie had found the invitation folded inside a drawer, touched her mother's name with one small finger, and asked if the sky remembered people. Caleb had not known how to answer, so he did what fathers sometimes do when their hearts are too full for words. He packed 2 sandwiches, pressed his only clean shirt, and bought 2 tickets he could barely afford. At the airport, Sophie walked close to him, her yellow backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, the silver Raven 1 pin fastened near the zipper. It had belonged to Caleb before it belonged to memory. Rachel used to joke that the badge made him look too serious, but after every flight, She would tap it once and say, "Bring that quiet man home to me." Sophie knew the story by heart. She also knew her father did not like telling the rest of it. "Are we really going to see Mommy's name?" she asked as they entered Terminal C, where the smell of coffee, wet coats, and floor cleaner mixed beneath the high glass ceiling. Caleb looked down at her and smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart. Will it make you sad?" "Probably. Then why are we going?" He stopped beside a row of check-in kiosks and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Because being sad is not the same as being afraid. Sometimes love asks us to show up." She nodded like she understood more than an 8-year-old should have to. At the counter, a young agent typed quickly, frowned at the screen, then glanced at Caleb's worn jacket and old work boots. "Your seats have been changed," she said. "There was a system issue." Caleb looked at the boarding passes. They had paid extra to sit together near the front, close to the wing, where Sophie felt safest. Now red ink crossed out their original seats, and new numbers had been printed near the back. 18B and 18C. "Are we still together?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Then that is enough." Sophie held the old boarding pass anyway, smoothing the red line with her thumb. "Why did they cross us out?" Caleb took a slow breath. Sometimes machines make mistakes. Across the priority lane, a man in a dark tailored suit stepped toward the counter, as if everyone else had been placed there to wait for him. Valley. Caleb recognized the face from a business article he had seen while repairing a navigation unit at the hangar. Northstar Investor. Cost cutter. Public smile, private pressure. Richard laughed into his phone and said, "I do not care about a minor maintenance flag. Get this flight moving." Caleb looked at him for only a second, but the old instinct inside him stirred. Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, what is a maintenance flag?" Caleb folded the boarding passes carefully and guided her toward security. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes had changed. "It means somebody noticed something they should not ignore." By the time Caleb and Sophie reached gate C-17, the waiting area was already crowded with people pretending not to be impatient. A businessman tapped angrily at his laptop. A mother balanced a stroller, 2 paper cups, and a sleeping toddler. College students in sweatshirts leaned against the windows, watching rain bead and slide across the glass. Outside, the Northstar jet sat under a pale morning sky, its white fuselage shining beneath runway lights that had not yet faded. Sophie pressed close to Caleb as boarding began, one hand around the strap of her yellow backpack and the other holding the wrinkled boarding pass with the red line across their old seats. Caleb noticed how tightly she held it, but he did not tell her to let go. Children keep small proofs when the world feels too large. "Group 2, the gate agent called. Richard Vale stepped forward before the announcement had finished, his phone still against his ear, his voice smooth and annoyed. "Tell operations I want no more delays. I have a 12 o'clock meeting in Denver, and I am not losing a signed term sheet because someone in maintenance got nervous." He brushed past Caleb without looking, then stopped when Sophie's backpack lightly touched the sleeve of his expensive navy jacket. It was barely a bump, the kind that happens in every airport every morning. Still, Richard looked down as if something unpleasant had landed on him. Sophie froze. "I am sorry," she whispered. Richard glanced at the silver Raven 1 pin on her bag and gave a thin smile. "Cute toy." Caleb stepped half a pace between them. She apologized. Richard looked him over, from the faded denim jacket to the scuffed boots that still carried the faint smell of machine oil from the hangar. "Then teach her not to swing that thing around in first-class traffic." The words were not loud, but they were sharp enough to cut. Sophie's cheeks turned pink. Caleb's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart." Inside the jet bridge, the air grew warmer and smelled faintly of damp carpet and coffee. Sophie counted her steps the way her mother had taught her when fear started climbing up her chest. 1, 2, breathe. 3, 4, listen. Caleb walked beside her without rushing. In the doorway of the aircraft, Marla Kent greeted passengers with a practiced smile that had already grown tired around the edges. "Welcome aboard." "Good morning," Caleb said. Sophie tried to smile, too. Marla's eyes flicked to their boarding passes, then to Caleb's clothes, then to Sophie's pale face. The smile weakened. "You are seated in row 18. "Yes, ma'am." They moved down the aisle past first class, where Richard was already seated with a glass of water and the expression of a man offended by ordinary people. As Sophie passed, her shoulder brushed the side of his seat. He leaned away dramatically. "There she is again," he said. Caleb stopped. "Sir, she is 8 years old." Richard turned toward Marla. "Is that child all right? She looks panicked. I do not want a disturbance once we are in the air." Sophie looked at the floor. "I am not a disturbance." Her voice was so small that only Caleb heard the break in it. Marla hesitated, caught between policy, pressure, and the wealthy passenger staring at her as if her job depended on pleasing him. A young man in row 6 lifted his phone, not openly at first, just enough to record the tension. Another passenger whispered, "What is going on?" Caleb guided Sophie toward row 18, but Richard was not finished. People like that always say everything is fine until the crew has to turn the plane around. The cabin grew quiet in the way public places grow quiet when no one wants to defend the person being embarrassed. Caleb helped Sophie into the window seat and placed her backpack beneath the seat in front of her. She kept the old boarding pass in her lap. "Daddy," she whispered, "what if they make us leave?" Caleb buckled her seat belt with careful hands. "Then we leave with our heads up." Up front, Marla spoke softly into her crew phone, her eyes moving back toward them twice. In seat 2A, a woman in a charcoal blazer watched without blinking. Evelyn Hart had boarded under her private itinerary. No badge, no assistant, no announcement. She had planned to observe cabin service quietly before the memorial in Denver. But now she was studying Caleb Mercer, because when Richard mentioned the maintenance flag again under his breath, Caleb was not looking at Richard. He was listening to the airplane. Then Sophie tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy." The man said the flag thing again. Caleb looked toward first class, then toward the sealed cockpit door, and the soft hum beneath the floor shifted by half a beat. It was almost nothing. Almost. But his face became very still. Marla returned to row 18 with the kind of careful smile people wear when they have already decided what they are going to do and only need the room to accept it. Behind her, Richard Vale watched from first class with his phone lowered now, satisfied to let someone else carry out the cruelty. Sophie sat very still by the window, her knees together, her yellow backpack tucked under the seat, the silver Raven 1 pin catching a thin stripe of morning light. Caleb looked up before Marla spoke. He had heard the crew phone click, the whisper near the galley, the soft change in the air vents above row 17. None of it belonged to panic. All of it belonged to pressure. "Mr. Mercer," Marla said, keeping her voice low enough to sound polite and loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We are going to need you and your daughter to step off the aircraft for a brief conversation with gate personnel." Sophie's fingers tightened around the old boarding pass. "Did I do something bad?" she asked. Caleb turned to her first, not Marla, not Richard, not the phones beginning to rise again. "No, sweetheart. You did nothing bad." "Sir," Marla said, "this will go smoother if you cooperate." Caleb nodded once, slow and calm. "I will cooperate with safety. I will not cooperate with shame." A murmur passed through the cabin. Richard exhaled a laugh. There it is. The speech. Caleb stood in the aisle, but he did not reach for the bags. His eyes moved toward the ceiling panel above them, then toward the front of the cabin, where the hum of the aircraft seemed to pulse twice and settle wrong. It was a small sound, the kind most passengers would confuse with air conditioning. Caleb did not. He had spent years listening to machines before they confessed. "Before we step off," he said quietly, "did the captain sign off the left environmental pack?" Marla blinked. "Excuse me?" "The left environmental pack," Caleb repeated. "It cycled twice during ground power transfer. That is not normal for this aircraft under these conditions." Richard sat forward, smiling with open disbelief. Now the mechanic thinks he is a pilot. A few people laughed, but it died quickly because Caleb was not performing. He was listening. His expression had the stillness of a man standing beside a closed door and hearing water behind it. Marla's face hardened. "Mr. Mercer, you need to stop pretending you understand aircraft systems." "I am not pretending." "Then what exactly are you claiming?" "I am saying that if the cockpit got a cabin pressure or pack control advisory on the ground, this flight should not move until maintenance verifies the fault source." Marla opened her mouth, but before she could answer, the cockpit door unlocked. The first officer stepped out, young, pale, and trying too hard to look composed. His name tag read Daniel Price. He looked at Marla first. "Is there a passenger issue?" Richard raised a hand. "Yes, that man and his child are delaying the flight." Caleb did not look at Richard. He looked at the first officer. "Did you get advisory 7-3 left pack disagree?" Followed by a reset prompt. Daniel Price stopped breathing for half a second. It was enough. Evelyn Hart saw it from seat 2A. Marla saw it too, and suddenly her radio felt heavier in her hand. The first officer lowered his voice. "How would you know that?" Caleb glanced at Sophie, and for the first time that morning, pain crossed his face. Not fear. Memory. Because that advisory lies when the secondary sensor is warm and the valve response is late. Daniel swallowed. "That is not in the passenger safety card." "No," Caleb said. "It is not." Evelyn rose from her seat with quiet authority, smoothing the front of her charcoal blazer. "Mr. Mercer," she said, studying his face as if matching it to a name buried somewhere in an old file. "Where did you learn that code?" Caleb looked toward the wing, where rain trembled along the metal skin. "The hard way." The cabin fell into a strange silence, no longer entertained, no longer annoyed. Even Richard stopped smiling. Daniel Price took one careful step closer, his eyes dropping to the silver pin on Sophie's backpack. The letters were worn, but still readable. Raven 1. His voice changed when he spoke again. "Sir," he asked softly, "were you Air Force?" Caleb did not answer right away, and that silence told the cabin more than a speech ever could. The first officer stood in the aisle with one hand still near the cockpit door, waiting, while Marla looked between the two men as if the floor beneath her polished shoes had quietly shifted. Sophie looked up at her father. She had heard that question before, usually from old men at memorial services or mechanics at the hangar who recognized the way Caleb read a control panel like scripture. But she had also learned that some parts of her father lived behind locked doors. "Daddy," she whispered, "is it okay?" Caleb lowered his eyes to her, and his face softened. "Only if you want it to be." Sophie reached down for her yellow backpack. The zipper made a small sound in the quiet cabin, louder than it should have been, like a match struck in a dark room. From inside, she pulled out a small blue tin with chipped paint along the lid. Rachel Mercer had once kept cough drops in it during rescue flights over Colorado, but now it held the few things Sophie trusted most: a folded photograph, a silver-winged badge, and a creased sheet of paper covered in careful handwriting. Richard Vale muttered, "This is ridiculous," but no one answered him. Sophie opened the tin and held up the badge first. The letters at the bottom were faded, but Daniel Price leaned closer and read them under his breath. Captain Caleb Mercer, Raven 1. Marla's expression changed. The title did not fit the man she had tried to remove. It did not fit the boots, the old jacket, the quiet hands. But truth has never cared whether it matches someone's prejudice. Evelyn Hart stepped into the aisle now, no longer merely watching. Her eyes moved from the badge to the folded paper in Sophie's hand. "May I see that?" she asked gently. Sophie looked at Caleb. He nodded. Evelyn took the paper with both hands, respectful, as if accepting something fragile from a church altar. Across the top, in dark blue ink, were 3 words: breathe, count, listen. Beneath them was a short emergency sequence, simple enough for a frightened child to remember, precise enough for a trained crew to respect. Evelyn read the first line, then the second, and her face went still. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "My mom kept it," Sophie said. "She said Dad wrote it when people forgot how to stay calm." Caleb looked away toward the rain-streaked window. The aircraft hummed around him, alive with systems, wires, valves, and warnings. But for a moment all he heard was Rachel's voice from years ago, teasing him for writing checklists on napkins, telling him that calm was a gift when fear filled the room. Evelyn, read the page again. Slower this time. This sequence, she said, almost to herself, is the foundation of Emergency Cabin Pressure Protocol 7. Daniel Price looked at her. North Star uses that in annual recurrent training. Evelyn's thumb brushed the edge of the paper. Yes, we do. Caleb's voice stayed low. Then your company should know why the advisory matters. Evelyn looked at him, and now there was recognition in her eyes. Not complete, but growing. The original author file for that protocol was sealed after a legal settlement. No one in current operations ever talks about who wrote it. Sophie tucked the photograph against her chest. It showed Rachel in a flight nurse uniform, smiling beside Caleb on a windy runway. His Raven 1 badge bright on his chest before grief made him disappear into ordinary clothes. Mom said he saved people before, Sophie said. Her voice shook, but she did not lower it. She said he heard problems before they became emergencies. The cabin held its breath. Phones lowered. I softened. Even the people who had been waiting to be entertained began to understand that they had been watching a father carry a history none of them had earned the right to judge. Evelyn handed the paper back to Sophie, then pulled out her phone and dialed with a steady hand. When the call connected, her voice turned firm, clear, and official. This is Evelyn Hart. Pull the original author file for Emergency Cabin Pressure Protocol 7. Name search Caleb Mercer. Also cross-reference Raven 1. She listened for 3 seconds. Then her gaze moved to Richard Vale, who had suddenly stopped checking his watch. Evelyn's voice dropped. Yes, I need it now. Evelyn kept the phone to her ear, but her eyes never left Richard Vale. The cabin had changed so quietly that no one could name the exact second it happened. A few minutes earlier, Caleb Mercer had been a tired father in old boots, a man people felt free to measure by the grease near his cuff and the fear in his daughter's eyes. Now every soft click, every breath from the vents, every blink from the first officer seemed to gather around him with a new kind of weight. Evelyn listened, her expression tightening one line at a time. Say that again, she said into the phone. Daniel Price stood beside the cockpit door, no longer trying to look calm. Marla Kent held her radio against her chest with both hands. Sophie sat upright in the window seat, the blue tin open in her lap, her mother's photograph resting against the folded checklist. Caleb did not move. He looked toward the front galley, past Richard's polished shoes, past the first-class curtain, toward the place where decisions were made before ordinary passengers ever knew they were in danger. Evelyn lowered the phone a few inches. The original author file confirms Captain Caleb Mercer, United States Air Force, call sign Raven 1, consultant on Emergency Cabin Pressure Protocol 7. A whisper passed through the cabin. Richard gave a dry little laugh, but this time it sounded lonely. That proves he wrote a document years ago. It does not make him the captain of this aircraft. Caleb turned slightly. No one said it did. Then stop delaying my flight. It is not your flight, Caleb said. It is their flight too. He looked down the aisle, not dramatically, not for applause, but at the faces of people who had gone quiet because dignity had finally entered the room. An older woman in row 14 held her husband's hand. A college student lowered his phone completely. A father across the aisle pulled his little boy closer without saying why. Evelyn returned the phone to her ear. Send me the maintenance packet, the ground reset log, and the pre-departure delay record. She paused. All of it. Richard's smile faded. That information is operationally sensitive. Evelyn looked at him. And you know that how? The question landed softly, but it landed deep. Richard adjusted his cuff. I am a major investor. I know how delays affect performance. Caleb's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. Performance does not keep people breathing at 30,000 feet. Pressure does. Daniel Price glanced toward the cockpit. The captain is reviewing the reset now. Caleb shook his head once. The reset is not the problem. The missing reason for the reset is the problem. Evelyn's phone buzzed. A file appeared on her screen. She opened it, and the blue glow reflected in her eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. The rain tapped the windows. The vents sighed. Somewhere beneath the floor, the left system cycled again. Faint and wrong. Evelyn scrolled slowly. There are 5 minutes missing from the maintenance log. Marla whispered. That cannot happen. Caleb answered without looking at her. It can happen if someone removes the ground note before dispatch sees the chain. Daniel swallowed. Why would anyone do that? Caleb's gaze moved to Richard. Because a maintenance flag creates a delay. A delay creates a missed meeting. And a missed meeting can cost a man money. Richard stood halfway from his seat. You better be careful. Caleb did not flinch. I have been careful all morning. Sophie's small voice rose from row 18. Daddy, is the plane broken? Caleb turned back to her, and all the steel left his face. Not broken, sweetheart. Warning us. Evelyn's phone buzzed again. This time she read the message twice. Her voice became quieter, and that made it stronger. The delay code was changed before boarding finished. She looked at Richard. 5 minutes of data disappeared between the maintenance flag and your priority departure request. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came. Caleb looked toward the cockpit door, hearing the aircraft speak in the language of valves, pressure, and consequence. Then 5 minutes, he said, are all he needed. Evelyn did not reveal everything at once. She had spent 15 years in aviation safety, and she knew that rush truth could be dismissed as emotion, but patient truth could build a room no lie could escape. She lowered her phone, looked toward the forward galley and said, Marla, call maintenance on the crew line. Tell them we need a verbal confirmation of the left environmental pack reset. Marla blinked. Right now. Right now. Richard stood fully then, smoothing his jacket as if dignity could be pressed back into cloth. This is absurd. We are all sitting here because a mechanic with an old badge decided to play hero. Caleb looked at him with quiet eyes. I have not played anything today. You are delaying a commercial aircraft. No, Caleb said. Someone delayed the truth. The cabin absorbed that sentence slowly. Sophie watched her father from row 18, her small hands folded around the blue tin, her mother's photograph tucked safely inside again. She had seen Caleb fix radios, heaters, coffee makers, and once the old school bus that would not start on a snowy morning. But this was different. He was not just fixing something mechanical. He was standing in front of people who had decided he was small, and he was refusing to become cruel in order to prove he was not. Marla lifted the crew phone with trembling fingers. Her voice came out thin. This is forward cabin. We need verbal confirmation on the left environmental pack reset before departure. A pause. Then a faint male voice answered through the receiver, just loud enough for Evelyn and Caleb to hear. Reset was completed. Aircraft cleared. Caleb took one step closer, not threatening, not hurried. Ask who signed the reset. Marla swallowed. Who signed the reset? Another pause. Ground technician Miller. Caleb turned. To Daniel Price. Do you have a technician Miller on duty at this gate? Daniel looked down at the tablet in his hand, scrolling quickly. No. We have Hernandez, Lee, and Foster assigned to C-17. Evelyn's expression hardened. Ask what tablet was used. Marla repeated the question. The voice on the line hesitated. That hesitation moved through the cabin like a shadow. Richard stepped into the aisle. Enough. I know what this is. A nervous crew, a sentimental child, and a man with a tragic past looking for attention. Sophie flinched at the word tragic, but Caleb only turned his head. His voice stayed low. Do not use my daughter's grief to protect your schedule. The words were calm, but they carried. Richard's face tightened. You have no idea what is at stake. Evelyn asked softly, Then tell us. Richard looked at her, and for one careless second, pride outran caution. A left-side maintenance delay does not matter if the reset clears before pushback. That is standard operational tolerance. The silence after that was immediate. Daniel Price looked up from the tablet. Marla lowered the crew phone. Caleb did not move. Evelyn took one slow step toward Richard. "Mr. Vale," she said. "How did you know the warning was on the left side?" Richard's mouth opened, then closed. The answer he needed was not there. Sophie looked down at the wrinkled boarding pass in her lap, the old one with their original seats crossed out in red. Something about the timing returned to her, simple and clear in the way children sometimes see what adults step around. She raised the paper. "Miss Hart," she said, voice trembling but brave. "Our seats were changed before we got on." The lady at the counter said it was a system issue. Evelyn turned gently. "May I see it, Sophie?" Sophie handed it across the aisle. Evelyn read the timestamp printed near the bottom, then checked the delay record on her phone. Her face went still. This seat reassignment happened 4 minutes before the maintenance flag was officially logged. Caleb closed his eyes for half a breath. There it was. Not the whole truth, but the thread that would pull it loose. Evelyn looked back at Richard, and this time her voice did not shake at all. Someone wanted this father and this child moved to the back before anyone admitted there was a warning. Richard said nothing. For the first time all morning, the richest voice on the plane had run out of room. Evelyn Hart stood in the aisle with Sophie's old boarding pass in one hand and the maintenance packet glowing on her phone in the other, and the entire cabin seemed to lean toward her without moving. For almost a minute no one spoke. The rain slid down the windows. The overhead vents breathed their uneven breath. Richard Vale stood near first class with the stiff posture of a man who had spent his whole life believing money could make silence obey him. But this silence did not belong to him anymore. Evelyn looked toward Marla. "Close the forward service curtain. Keep the boarding door open. No one leaves. No one deletes anything. And no one touches the dispatch tablet until an independent safety team arrives." Marla's face had gone pale. "Yes, ma'am." Richard snapped his head toward Evelyn. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Evelyn reached into the inner pocket of her charcoal blazer and removed a slim identification card. She held it up, not dramatically, not proudly, but with the calm weight of authority finally stepping into the light. "Evelyn Hart, Director of Flight Safety for Northstar Airways." The words moved through the aircraft like a clean bell. Passengers straightened. Daniel Price let out a breath he had been holding. Marla looked as if the floor had dropped an inch beneath her. Richard's face tightened, then rearranged itself into the smile of a man searching for leverage. "Then you should understand the cost of this delay." Evelyn did not blink. "I understand the cost of ignoring a warning." Caleb remained beside row 18, one hand resting on the top of Sophie's seat, his eyes on the cockpit door. He was not interested in Richard's embarrassment. That was the difference between pride and dignity. Pride wants the room to watch someone fall. Dignity wants the truth to stand without needing applause. Daniel lifted the tablet. "Miss Hart, the captain is requesting guidance." Evelyn turned to Caleb. "Captain Mercer, I know you are not operating crew, but I need your assessment." Richard scoffed. "You cannot be serious." Caleb looked at Sophie. She held the blue tin against her chest and nodded, small but steady. He stepped toward the front, stopping just outside the cockpit door. "Do not cycle the pack again," he said. "Isolate the left side, verify secondary sensor drift, cross-check cabin rate against the standby reading, and review the last manual reset." Daniel repeated the sequence into the cockpit. 3 short instructions. 3 careful responses. 1 truth waiting beneath them. The captain's voice came faintly through the open crack of the cockpit door. "Standby reading does not match the dispatch log." Caleb closed his eyes for 1 second. Then the aircraft was cleared on paper before it was honest in the system. The cabin went still again, but this time the stillness had understanding inside it. Evelyn's phone buzzed. A new file arrived from operations, a recovered message chain pulled from the dispatch server. She read it once, then slowly lifted her eyes to Richard. "Mr. Vale, this message was sent from your executive account to ground operations at 9:27 this morning." Her voice stayed measured. "Remove the man and the child. They are slowing us down." A woman in row 14 covered her mouth. The college student who had been recording lowered his phone into his lap as if ashamed of what he had first hoped to capture. Marla turned toward Caleb and Sophie, tears shining but not yet falling. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Caleb did not answer right away. He looked at his daughter, and Sophie looked back with the kind of faith that can make a wounded man brave again. Richard reached for anger, for denial, for one last polished sentence, but none came. The richest voice on the plane had nothing left to buy. Evelyn raised the crew phone. "Operations, this is flight safety. This aircraft is grounded pending inspection. Secure all logs. Notify the gate supervisor and corporate compliance." Then she looked down the aisle at every passenger who had watched a father and child be judged by their clothes, their fear, and their silence. "This delay may have saved your lives." No one clapped. Not yet. The truth had landed too heavily for applause. It settled first as silence, deep and honest, while Caleb Mercer stood under the cabin lights with oil on his cuffs, grace in his posture, and his daughter's silver Raven 1 badge shining from a yellow backpack in row 18. The first person to move was not Richard Vale, not Marla Kent, and not anyone wearing a uniform. It was Sophie. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stepped into the aisle with the blue tin held carefully in both hands, and walked to her father as if the whole cabin had become a long church aisle and she was carrying something sacred. Caleb bent down before she reached him. For a moment, the man who had heard the aircraft before anyone else did, the man whose quiet knowledge had stopped a dangerous mistake from leaving the ground, looked only like a father trying not to cry in front of his little girl. Sophie opened the tin and took out the silver Raven 1 badge. "Mom said this helped you remember who you were," she whispered. Caleb swallowed. "Your mom always made ordinary things sound brave." Sophie pressed the badge into his palm. "Maybe they were brave because you carried them." Around them, passengers remained seated in a silence that no longer felt awkward, felt respectful. Outside the window, 2 maintenance trucks rolled across the wet concrete toward the aircraft, their amber lights turning slowly in the rain. The boarding door stayed open. Cool terminal air moved into the cabin, carrying the smell of coffee, jet fuel, and a morning that had almost gone very wrong. Evelyn Hart stood near the front galley, speaking with corporate compliance and the gate supervisor. Her voice was steady, but her eyes kept returning to Caleb and Sophie. She had seen emergency reports, failed audits, hidden risks, and polished executives who thought safety was a number on a spreadsheet. But she had rarely seen a man humiliated in public and still choose grace over revenge. Richard tried one more time. "Evelyn, this can be handled privately." Evelyn turned toward him. "It already should have been handled honestly." The gate supervisor arrived, with 2 North Star security coordinators and a corporate compliance officer. No one touched Richard. No one raised a voice. They simply asked him to collect his briefcase and step off the aircraft for questioning. That was the quietest part of his downfall, and somehow the most complete. Richard looked around, searching for support among the passengers who had once seemed willing to believe him. He found only lowered eyes, disappointed faces, and the heavy silence of people who had finally understood the cost of arrogance. Marla approached Caleb with trembling hands folded in front of her. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice broke on the name. "I judged you before I knew you. I judged your daughter before I listened to her. I am sorry." Caleb looked at Sophie first, because forgiveness from a father should never erase the pain of a child. Sophie studied Marla for a long moment, then nodded. "You made me feel like I did not belong here." Marla closed her eyes. "I know." Caleb placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Then remember her face the next time someone boards tired, scared, or wearing old shoes." Marla nodded through tears. "I will." 40 minutes later, the passengers were moved safely back into the terminal, while the inspection team confirmed the fault Caleb had warned them about. A replacement aircraft was arranged, but the mood at Gate C-17 had changed. No one complained about the delay now. People spoke softly. A woman brought Sophie hot chocolate. The college student who had recorded the first moments deleted the video and apologized to Caleb without asking to be praised for it. Evelyn found them near the window, where Sophie watched rainwater slide across the wing of the grounded jet. "Captain Mercer," Evelyn said, "your name is going back where it belongs. Protocol 7 will list its original author. And Northstar is establishing a Rachel Mercer Memorial Scholarship for children of flight nurses and rescue crews." Caleb looked down. "I did not do this for recognition." "I know," Evelyn said. "That is why it matters." Sophie leaned against him. "Daddy, are we still going to Denver?" Caleb looked through the glass at the gray sky, then at the badge resting in his palm. For years, he had thought grief meant staying away from the places that remembered Rachel too clearly. But maybe healing was not forgetting the sky. Maybe healing was letting it carry them one more mile. He took Sophie's hand. "Yes, sweetheart. We are going to see your mother's name." When they finally boarded the new plane, no one rushed them. Marla was not on that crew, but a young flight attendant greeted Sophie with a gentle smile and said, "Welcome aboard, Miss Mercer." Sophie looked up at Caleb, surprised by the respect in the woman's voice. Caleb smiled back, quiet and tired and whole in a way he had not felt for years. As they passed first class, an older passenger stood. Then another. Then row by row, people rose without clapping, without cheering, without turning the moment into noise. They simply stood. Caleb paused in the aisle, humbled by a silence that no longer wounded him. Sophie squeezed his hand and whispered, "Mom was right." Caleb looked down at her. "About what?" She smiled toward the window, where the clouds were beginning to break over the runway. "The sky did carry us home.